MGM buried a James Bond franchise deal worth $2 billion that would have changed what spy cinema looks like today. And the reason they killed it is something they never wanted you to know. Start there. Hold that. Because what got buried wasn't just a single film. It was an entire future. A signed term sheet. A handshake that became a press release that became nothing. And the reason it died, it wasn't box office risk. It wasn't creative disagreement. It was something far more deliberate and far more damaging. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why Bond has never quite reached the ceiling everyone knew it could. To understand what happened, you have to go back to 2012. MGM had just emerged from bankruptcy, a Chapter 11 filing that had stalled Skyfall in pre-production for 2 years and left the studio functionally paralyzed. The Bond franchise, the single most valuable intellectual property MGM owned, had been dark since 2008. Quantum of Solace had disappointed. The franchise felt rudderless, and every major entertainment player in Hollywood was circling. Into that vacuum stepped one of the most aggressive acquisitions teams in the industry. The company, and you'll recognize the name, had already spent 3 years quietly acquiring back catalog libraries and franchise anchors. Their pitch to MGM's board was specific, not the whole studio, just Bond. The entire 7 franchise lock, stock, and silenced wall their PPK for a valuation of $2 billion. The deal had internal champions. It had legal paperwork. It had momentum. What it had specifically was a term sheet signed in March of 2012. The acquiring party, a major studio with deep franchise infrastructure and an expanding production slate, offered MGM's restructuring creditors a clean exit. $2 billion, or roughly $1.87 billion in the finalized figures, for perpetual rights to produce, distribute, and extend the Bond universe in any format: film, television, digital. The deal included a licensing carve-out that would have allowed Eon Productions, the Broccoli family's production company that has actually made every Bond film since 1962, to remain as creative partners, but no longer as gatekeepers. Gary Barber, who had just become MGM's new CEO during the reorganization, reportedly received the term sheet on a Tuesday. By Friday of that same week, he had scheduled a board meeting. The numbers worked. The creditors were interested. The acquiring studio had already begun internal pre-production conversations about what the first post-acquisition Bond film would look like. Then it vanished. Not quietly, aggressively. Because the moment Barbara Broccoli, Eon's controlling producer and the daughter of the man who built the Bond franchise from a paperback novel, learned the specifics of what was on the table, she moved. Broccoli holds a right of first negotiation in her production agreement with MGM, a clause that had existed in various forms since 1977. It means that before MGM can transfer the creative reins on Bond to anyone, Eon gets a formal opportunity to object, counter, or restructure the deal. She objected. She countered. And what she proposed effectively made the original deal impossible, because what she wanted was something no acquiring studio was willing to grant. Here's what the trades didn't report. Broccoli's counter wasn't a negotiating position. It was a kill switch. She demanded that any buyer agree to a production veto she and Michael G. Wilson would hold jointly, not just on casting or director selection, but on release windows, sequel timelines, and format expansion. Meaning, no streaming spin-offs, no Bond television series, no cinematic universe expansion with supporting characters in their own films. Bond, in her framework, would remain exactly what it had always been: a single franchise, 2 to 3 year theatrical release cycle, under her creative authority, forever. The acquiring studio's entire valuation model depended on franchise expansion. They had projected a television series generating $400 million in first-cycle licensing. They had modeled a supporting character spin-off film slate. Every dollar of that $2 billion was premised on Bond becoming something bigger than Bond. Broccoli's counter collapsed the model overnight, but here's the part they really buried. Remember that signed term sheet? Here's where it actually died. MGM's board had a second option. They could have gone around broccoli entirely. The clause she held had never been tested in litigation, and at least two of MGM's legal advisors at the time, this is documented in court filings from a separate dispute, believed her veto right was structurally unenforceable under the reorganization terms. MGM chose not to test it, and the question you have to ask is why? Because if that deal had closed, Bond doesn't belong to a single franchise model anymore. You get the television series, you get the character spin-offs. You potentially get a shared universe, M, Q, Moneypenny, all of them carrying their own narratives into their own films. You get a version of Seven that functions less like a single actor's vehicle and more like a property with 100 years of storytelling runway. Instead, you got a franchise that went dark again. That has produced 4 films in 14 years. That has spent more time negotiating with itself than making movies. The deal is dead. The clause held. But MGM is now Amazon's, and Amazon has its own ideas about what Bond becomes next. Which studios buried deal surfaces first? That answer might be worse than this one.